Imagine a Kurdish boy born in a crumbling fortress on the banks of the Tigris River. He had no royal blood, no great army, and no claim to any throne. And yet this man would unite the entire Muslim world and bring the mighty Crusader kingdoms to their knees. This is Saladin, the sultan who conquered Jerusalem without a massacre. But before we drift off into the story, leave a like and comment where you are listening from so others can find their way here too. Now, let us journey back to the burning deserts of the 12th century to discover how one man's honour changed the course of history. The story of Saladin begins not with a grand destiny, but with a world torn apart by war. In the early 12th century, the lands of the Middle East were a shattered mosaic of rival kingdoms and warring factions. The great Muslim empires that had once stretched from Spain to India were now divided into dozens of small competing states. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which had once ruled all of Islam, was now a mere shadow of its former glory. The Caliph was a puppet, a religious figurehead with no real power. The actual rulers were Turkish military commanders who had seized control of the various provinces. Sultans fought sultans over scraps of territory. Emirs betrayed their masters for a few more villages. The unity that had made the early Islamic conquest possible had crumbled into chaos. And into this chaos had come a terrifying new force from the west. In 1099, armies of European knights had conquered Jerusalem in the First Crusade. The call had gone out from Pope Urban II at Clermont in France. "God wills it," the crowds had shouted. Tens of thousands of knights and common people had marched across Europe and through the Byzantine Empire. They had endured terrible hardships, disease, and hunger. Many had died along the way, but the survivors had pressed on, driven by religious fervour and the promise of heavenly reward. The fall of the Holy City had been a catastrophe for the Muslim world. The Crusaders had massacred the population, Muslim and Jewish alike, in a bloodbath that shocked even that violent age. The streets of Jerusalem had run ankle-deep with blood. The Crusaders had then established a chain of Christian kingdoms along the coast of the Holy Land. There was the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These Crusader states were like a dagger plunged into the heart of the Muslim world. For nearly a century, they had held their ground against all attempts to dislodge them. It was into this fractured and violent world that Saladin was born around the year 1137 or 1138. His birthplace was the fortress of Tikrit, a dusty stronghold on the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. His family was not Arab, but Kurdish, an ethnic group from the mountainous regions between Persia and Anatolia. The Kurds were a proud warrior people, respected for their fighting skills, but often looked down upon by the Arab and Turkish elites who dominated the region. Saladin's father was named Ayyub, and he served as the governor of Tikrit under a powerful warlord. On the very night Saladin was born, his family's fortunes took a terrible turn. His uncle Shirkuh had killed a man in a dispute. The family was forced to flee Tikrit in disgrace, leaving behind their home and their position. The exiled family eventually found refuge in the city of Mosul, and later in the great city of Damascus. Here, Saladin's father Ayyub entered the service of a rising Turkish warlord named Zengi. Zengi was one of the first Muslim leaders to seriously challenge the Crusader states. He had conquered the important city of Edessa from the Christians, sending shockwaves through Europe. When Zengi was murdered by a slave, his son Nur ad-Din inherited his empire. Nur ad-Din was a deeply pious and capable ruler. He dreamed of uniting the Muslim world and driving the Crusaders into the sea. Saladin's father and uncle became trusted commanders in his army. The young Saladin grew up in the courts and military camps of these powerful men. He received an education befitting a young nobleman of his time. He studied the Quran and learned to recite it from memory. He studied Islamic law and the traditions of the Prophet. He learned poetry, both Arabic and Persian, and became skilled at composing verses himself. He studied mathematics and astronomy. He learned to ride horses and camels, to fight with sword and lance and bow. He learned the arts of siege warfare and battlefield tactics. Most importantly, he learned the complex and treacherous game of politics that dominated the Muslim world. He watched his father and uncle navigate the dangerous waters of Nur ad-Din's court. He saw how alliances were made and broken, how rivals were destroyed, and how power was won and lost. These lessons would serve him well in the years to come. By all accounts, the young Saladin showed little early ambition for military glory. Some sources describe him as more interested in religious studies and theology than in warfare. He was known for his love of religious discussions and his strict personal piety. He was quiet and thoughtful, a sharp contrast to his fierce and aggressive uncle Shirkuh. Some of the Syrian nobles considered him soft. He seemed more suited to be a scholar or a judge than a warrior. But fate had other plans for the young Kurdish nobleman. The great prize that all the powers of the region sought was Egypt. This ancient land, watered by the mighty Nile River, was the richest and most populous country in the Middle East. Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a rival Muslim dynasty that followed a different branch of Islam. The Fatimids were Shia Muslims, while Nur ad-Din and most of the Muslim world were Sunni. This religious divide was deep and bitter. The two branches of Islam had been fighting each other for centuries. The Fatimid Caliphate had once been powerful, ruling an empire that stretched from Morocco to Syria. But by the mid-12th century, it had grown weak and corrupt. The Fatimid caliphs were children, placed on the throne as puppets and controlled by scheming viziers who held the real power. These viziers fought among themselves, murdering and replacing each other in bloody coups. Egypt was tearing itself apart. Despite this chaos, Egypt was fabulously wealthy. The Nile River, flooding every year, deposited rich black soil across the land. Egypt produced vast quantities of grain and flax and sugar. The trade routes from India and Africa passed through Egyptian ports. Cairo, the Fatimid capital, was one of the largest cities in the world. Whoever controlled Egypt would control the most powerful state in the region. Both the Crusaders and Nur ad-Din understood this. They watched the chaos in Egypt with hungry eyes. A race began to see who could seize control of the dying Fatimid state first. In 1164, Nur ad-Din sent an army to Egypt under the command of Shirkuh, Saladin's uncle. Saladin, now in his late 20s, accompanied his uncle on this campaign. It was the beginning of his transformation from a scholar into a warrior. The Egyptian campaigns were long and complex, involving multiple invasions, alliances, and betrayals. The Crusaders sent their own armies to prop up various Egyptian factions. Shirkuh and Saladin fought them in brutal battles across the Nile Delta. In one famous engagement at Alexandria, Saladin was left to defend the city with a small garrison, while his uncle manoeuvred in the countryside. It was his first independent command. Alexandria was a great city, but it was not prepared for a siege. Saladin had only a handful of soldiers against a combined Crusader and Egyptian army. The odds seemed hopeless, but Saladin proved to be a natural leader of men. He organised the defence with skill and calm. He negotiated skillfully with the enemy, playing for time. He kept the morale of his men high despite their desperate situation. He rationed food and water carefully. When the soldiers grew discouraged, he reminded them of their duty to God and to their families. He held the city for months until his uncle could come to relieve him. It was the first indication that the quiet scholar had hidden depths. After 3 separate Egyptian campaigns spanning 5 years, Shirkuh finally succeeded in conquering Egypt in 1169. The Fatimid Caliph appointed Shirkuh as his vizier, the real ruler of the country. But Shirkuh's triumph was short-lived. Just 2 months after taking power, the old warrior died suddenly. The Syrian officers and Egyptian nobles who now controlled the country needed to choose a new leader. Many expected them to pick one of Shirkuh's more experienced commanders. Instead, to everyone's surprise, they chose the quiet and bookish Saladin. He was seen as young, pliable, and easy to control. They thought he would be a puppet they could manipulate. It was the greatest miscalculation in the history of the Crusades. Saladin was now the vizier of Egypt, the most powerful man in the richest country of the Muslim world. He was only 31 years old. His master Nur ad-Din in Damascus expected him to rule Egypt as a loyal subordinate, sending tribute and troops for the war against the Crusaders. But Saladin had other ideas. He moved quickly to consolidate his power in ways that surprised everyone who had thought him easy to manipulate. He replaced key officials with members of his own family and with loyal Kurdish and Turkish soldiers. His father Ayyub came to Egypt to serve as his chief advisor. His brothers and nephews were given important military and administrative positions. He dealt ruthlessly with plots against his rule. The old elites who had thought to control him quickly learned their mistake. When conspiracies were discovered, Saladin crushed them without hesitation. When the black African palace guards who had served the Fatimids for generations rose in rebellion, Saladin destroyed them utterly. These soldiers had been a powerful force in Egyptian politics for centuries. They saw Saladin as a foreign usurper and plotted to restore the old order. Saladin crushed their rebellion with overwhelming force. He burned their barracks and drove the survivors into exile. The message was clear. Anyone who opposed the new vizier would be destroyed. Within 2 years, he had transformed himself from a puppet into an absolute ruler of Egypt. In 1171, Saladin took the final step in his takeover of Egypt. The Fatimid Caliph lay dying. Saladin ordered that the Friday prayers in the mosques of Cairo be read in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, instead of the Fatimid Caliph. This was a revolutionary act. For over 200 years, Egypt had been the centre of Shia Islam under the Fatimids. With a single command, Saladin ended this era. The Fatimid Caliphate simply ceased to exist. Egypt was now a Sunni state, and Saladin was its unquestioned master. The relationship between Saladin and his master, Nur ad-Din, grew increasingly tense. Nur ad-Din suspected that his young subordinate was becoming too powerful and too independent. He demanded that Saladin join him in attacks on the Crusader states, but Saladin always found excuses to delay. The tension was building toward a crisis. Then, in May of 1174, Nur ad-Din died suddenly. He left behind a young son and an empire that immediately began to fracture. Saladin saw his opportunity and seized it. He marched his Egyptian army north into Syria, claiming that he was coming to protect the young son of Nur ad-Din from rivals and traitors. He presented himself as the loyal servant, preserving his master's legacy for his master's son. In reality, he was coming to take the empire for himself. Over the next 12 years, Saladin fought an almost constant series of wars to unite the Muslim world under his rule. These were not wars against the Crusaders. These were wars against fellow Muslims who stood in his path. He conquered Damascus, the great city where he had grown up. The city opened its gates to him without a fight. He took Aleppo after a long and difficult siege. Aleppo was a powerful fortress city, and its rulers resisted fiercely. Saladin had to blockade the city and starve it into submission. He fought and defeated the Zengid princes, who were the legitimate heirs of Nur ad-Din. These young men were the sons and grandsons of the man Saladin had sworn to serve. Now he was taking their inheritance by force. He battled the fearsome assassins, a secretive and deadly Shia sect based in the mountains of Syria. The assassins tried to kill Saladin twice. Once their agents infiltrated his camp and stabbed him in the head. He survived only because he was wearing armour under his clothes. Another time they attacked him during a siege. He escaped with minor wounds, but several of his guards were killed. These wars of unification were brutal and exhausting. Saladin spent more time fighting other Muslims than he did fighting the Crusaders during this period. This fact was not lost on his critics, both then and now. Some accused him of being a hypocrite. He claimed to be fighting for Islam, for the liberation of Jerusalem. But in reality, he was fighting for his own power and glory. He was spilling Muslim blood to build his personal empire. Saladin always defended himself by saying that unity was necessary before the Crusaders could be defeated. A divided Muslim world could never hope to drive the Christians from the Holy City. The previous 90 years had proven that. Only by bringing all the lands and armies under one command could victory be achieved. Whether his motives were pure religious zeal, personal ambition, or some combination of both, the result was undeniable. By 1186, Saladin had created the largest and most powerful Muslim state since the early days of Islam. He ruled from Egypt to Iraq, from Yemen to the borders of Anatolia. He commanded armies drawn from a dozen different peoples. And now, at last, he was ready to turn his full attention to the Crusaders. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had existed for almost 90 years by the time Saladin completed his unification of the Muslim world. It was a remarkable achievement of survival against the odds. This small Christian state was surrounded on all sides by enemies. Its total population was probably less than 1 million people. The fighting strength of the kingdom was perhaps a few thousand knights, and a similar number of infantry. They faced enemies who could field armies many times their size. The kingdom depended on a constant flow of reinforcements and money from Europe. Pilgrims and adventurers arrived every year, some to pray, some to fight, some to seek their fortunes. But the distance from Europe was vast and help was always uncertain. the kingdom survived through a combination of strong fortifications, skilled diplomacy, and above all the disunity of its Muslim neighbours. The Crusaders built some of the most impressive castles in history. They played the Muslim princes against each other. So long as the Muslim world was divided, the Crusaders could survive. Saladin's unification of the Muslim lands changed everything. The Crusader kingdom was also weakened by its own internal conflicts during this critical period. King Baldwin IV, who ruled when Saladin rose to power, was a remarkable man who suffered from leprosy. The disease had been discovered when he was just a boy. His tutor noticed that the young prince felt no pain when his arm was scratched during play. Leprosy in that age was a sentence of slow and horrible death. The disease would gradually destroy his body, rotting his flesh and leaving him blind and crippled. Yet Baldwin refused to give in to despair. Despite his terrible disease, which slowly destroyed his body over the years, Baldwin was an effective ruler and a capable general. He had actually defeated Saladin in battle at Montgisard in 1177, one of the few major defeats Saladin ever suffered. In that battle, Baldwin led his small force of knights in a desperate charge against Saladin's much larger army. The Muslims were caught by surprise and routed. Saladin himself barely escaped. It was a stunning victory that showed what the Crusaders could achieve under strong leadership. But Baldwin's disease was relentless. By his mid-20s, he was blind and could barely move. He had to be carried into battle on a litter. He died at the age of 24. After his death, the kingdom fell into chaos. Different factions fought over the succession. The crown eventually passed to Guy of Lusignan, a weak and incompetent ruler who was easily manipulated by more powerful nobles. The most dangerous noble in the kingdom was Reynald of Chatillon. Reynald was a French knight who had come to the Holy Land decades earlier seeking his fortune. Through a combination of courage, treachery, and lucky marriages, he had risen to become one of the most powerful lords in the kingdom. He held the great fortress of Kerak, which controlled the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria. Reynald was everything Saladin was not. Where Saladin was calculating and patient, willing to wait years for the right moment, Reynald was impulsive and reckless. Where Saladin honoured truces and treated prisoners according to the customs of civilized warfare, Reynald broke his word whenever it suited him and delighted in cruelty. Reynald had spent years raiding Muslim pilgrims and merchant caravans, even when truces were supposedly in effect. The pilgrimage to Mecca was one of the 5 pillars of Islam. The caravans that crossed the desert to Mecca were filled with pilgrims, merchants, and their goods. They were supposed to be protected by the truces between Saladin and the Crusaders. Reynald attacked them anyway. Most outrageously, Reynald had launched a naval expedition into the Red Sea. He built ships at Kerak, transported them in pieces across the desert, and assembled them on the coast. His fleet then sailed south, attacking the ports that served Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest cities of Islam. The very idea was an outrage that the Muslim world could never forget or forgive. Reynald had violated the most sacred places in Islam. Saladin had sworn a personal oath to kill Reynald with his own hands. This was not a casual threat. In the culture of that time and place, such oaths were sacred bonds. A man's honour depended on fulfilling his sworn word. In late 1186, despite a truce between Saladin and the Crusader kingdom, Reynald attacked another rich caravan. When King Guy refused to punish Reynald or return the stolen goods, Saladin had the excuse he needed. The time for the final war had come. In the spring of 1187, Saladin assembled the largest Muslim army seen in generations. Soldiers came from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and beyond. He led this massive force across the Jordan River and into the Crusader kingdom. His strategy was simple but effective. He besieged the city of Tiberias on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Saladin knew that the Crusaders would have to march to relieve the city. He was counting on it. King Guy gathered every available fighting man in the kingdom. He assembled the largest Crusader army ever seen in the Holy Land. The true cross, believed to be the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified, was carried with the army. The debate over what to do tore the Crusader leadership apart. Count Raymond of Tripoli urged caution. He knew the land between the Crusader camp and Tiberias was a waterless desert. He warned that marching across it in the summer heat would exhaust the army. But Reynald of Chatillon and the more aggressive nobles accused Raymond of cowardice. They convinced King Guy to march. The decision to march was the worst military decision in the history of the Crusades. On the 3rd of July 1187, the Crusader army set out across the barren hills toward Tiberias. It was the height of summer. The temperature was well over 100 degrees. The heat shimmered off the rocks. There was not a drop of water to be found along the route. The army marched in heavy armour under the blazing sun. The knights rode horses that stumbled with exhaustion. The infantry trudged along, already parched before midday. Saladin's cavalry harassed the army constantly, picking off stragglers and shooting arrows into the marching columns. Light Muslim horsemen would dash in, loose their arrows, and ride away before the Crusaders could respond. The Christians could not stop to rest, or they would be overwhelmed. They could not turn to fight, or the main Muslim army would catch them in the open. They could only keep marching, under the sun, under the arrows, dying of thirst. By evening, the army was still miles from Tiberias. They could not reach water before nightfall. King Guy was forced to make camp on a dry plateau near a hill with two peaks called the Horns of Hattin. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and completely surrounded. That night, Saladin's men set fire to the dry grass and scrub around the Crusader camp. The smoke and heat added to the misery of the Christian soldiers. They could not sleep. They could not rest. They could only wait for the dawn and the battle that would decide everything. On the morning of July 4th, 1187, the Battle of Hattin began. It was less a battle than a massacre. The Crusader infantry, driven mad by thirst, broke formation and fled toward the Sea of Galilee. They could see the water glittering in the distance, beautiful and unreachable. They were cut down or captured by the thousands before they ever reached it. The knights fought with desperate courage, but they were completely surrounded. Their horses were exhausted and dying of thirst. Many knights had to fight on foot. Charge after charge was launched against the Muslim lines, trying to break through. Each charge was thrown back with heavy losses. The True Cross was captured by the Muslims, a disaster of incalculable symbolic importance. King Guy's tent was overrun. By afternoon, it was over. The cream of the Crusader military was dead or in chains. King Guy himself was captured, found sitting dazed near his collapsed tent. Reynald of Chatillon was captured, still defiant. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had effectively ceased to exist in a single terrible afternoon. What happened next would define Saladin's reputation for all time. The captive King Guy was brought before Saladin in his tent. Saladin treated him with courtesy and respect. He offered the thirsty king a cup of iced water, a gesture of hospitality that in Arab culture meant the guest was safe. Guy drank and then passed the cup to Reynald of Chatillon. Saladin immediately clarified that he had not offered the water to Reynald. He would show no mercy to this man. According to most accounts, Saladin then personally struck Reynald with his sword. His guards finished the job. Saladin had fulfilled his oath. But to the other prisoners, Saladin showed remarkable clemency. King Guy and most of the noble prisoners were eventually ransomed. Common soldiers were sold into slavery, the normal fate of prisoners in that era, but many were also released. The fall of the Crusader army at Hattin left the Holy Land virtually defenceless. In the weeks and months that followed, Saladin swept through the kingdom like a whirlwind. City after city opened its gates. Acre, Jaffa, Beirut, Ascalon. One by one, the cities fell to Saladin's advancing armies. By September of 1187, only a handful of strongholds remained in Crusader hands, and Saladin's army stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem was sacred to three faiths. For Muslims, it was the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. According to Islamic tradition, this was the place where the Prophet Muhammad had ascended to heaven during his miraculous night journey. After Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem was the third holiest city in Islam. For Christians, it was the city where Jesus had been crucified and buried. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site of the crucifixion and the empty tomb, was the most sacred church in Christendom. For Jews, it was the location of the ancient temple, the holiest site in their religion. When the First Crusade had captured Jerusalem in 1099, the Christian knights had committed an atrocity that had shocked even that violent age. They had massacred the Muslim and Jewish population without mercy. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets. The Jews of the city were burned alive in their main synagogue. This atrocity had never been forgotten. It was burned into the memory of the Muslim world. Many in Saladin's army wanted revenge. They wanted to repay blood with blood. The defence of Jerusalem was organised by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few Crusader nobles to escape the disaster at Hattin. Balian had actually been at Hattin, but had fought his way out when the battle was lost. He had come to Jerusalem to evacuate his wife and children. Saladin gave him safe conduct for this purpose. But when Balian arrived, he found a city in chaos. The city was packed with refugees from all the fallen towns, but it had almost no soldiers. The garrison had marched to Hattin and died there. Balian sent a message to Saladin, asking to be released from his promise to leave. The people of Jerusalem had begged him to stay and lead their defence. There was literally no one else. Saladin, showing the honour that was characteristic of him, agreed. He allowed Balian to stay and defend the city. Balian knighted every noble boy over the age of 15. He armed the common people with whatever weapons could be found. But everyone knew the situation was hopeless. Saladin's army surrounded the city and began their assault on September 20th, 1187. The Muslims attacked the walls with siege engines and miners. They pounded the walls with catapults. After less than 2 weeks of siege, the walls were breached in several places. The city could not hold much longer. Balian rode out to negotiate with Saladin. The first meeting did not go well. Saladin was in a strong position and he knew it. He refused any terms. He declared that he would take the city by force and treat its people as the Crusaders had treated the Muslims. In 1099, he would give the city to his soldiers to plunder for 3 days. The population would be massacred or enslaved. Jerusalem would be purified with blood, just as the Crusaders had purified it with Muslim and Jewish blood 88 years before. But Balian made a desperate threat. If Saladin refused terms, the Christians would destroy everything sacred in the city before they died. They would tear down the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque with their own hands. They would kill the 5,000 Muslim prisoners they held in the city. They would slaughter their own families rather than let them be taken as slaves. They would burn Jerusalem to the ground rather than surrender it. The destruction would be so complete that Saladin would win nothing but ashes. Whether Balian could have actually carried out this threat is unclear. The defenders were weak and desperate, but Saladin took the threat seriously. The destruction of the third holiest site in Islam was a risk he could not take. The terms that Saladin finally agreed to were remarkably generous, considering his military advantage. The Christian population would be allowed to ransom themselves. A man could buy his freedom for 10 gold dinars. A woman could be ransomed for 5 dinars. A child could be freed for 1 dinar. Those who could not pay the ransom within 40 days would be enslaved, but Saladin allowed the full 40 days for the money to be gathered. Families were allowed to pool their resources. When it became clear that many of the poor could never raise the money, no matter how much time they had, Saladin freed thousands more without payment. His brother, Al-Adil, asked for 1,000 slaves as his share of the spoils, and then immediately freed them. Balian negotiated the ransom of thousands more using the treasury of the kingdom. Saladin himself paid the ransom for many elderly people who had no one to help them. He allowed widows and orphans to leave without payment. He provided food and water for the refugees leaving the city. There was no massacre. There was no wholesale destruction. The conquest of Jerusalem in 1187 stands in stark contrast to the bloodbath of 1099. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem in triumph. It was the 27th day of Rajab by the Islamic calendar, the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to heaven. This was a deeply symbolic date, chosen deliberately. Saladin understood the power of symbols. The great cross that the Crusaders had placed on top of the Dome of the Rock was torn down. Muslim soldiers dragged it through the streets while crowds cheered. The dome itself was purified with rosewater. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had converted into a palace for the kings of Jerusalem, was restored to its proper function. Friday prayers were held in Jerusalem for the first time in 88 years. But Saladin did not destroy the Christian holy places. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest shrine in Christendom, was left intact. Some of his advisors urged him to tear it down or convert it into a mosque. Saladin refused. He pointed out that the holiness of the site came from what had happened there, not from any building. Christians were allowed to continue their pilgrimages. The Eastern Christians, the Orthodox, and the other native Christian communities were allowed to stay and worship freely. The Jewish population, which had been expelled by the Crusaders, was allowed to return. It was this restraint, this mercy at the moment of triumph, that made Saladin a legend even among his enemies. The news of the fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe to its core. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief when he heard the news. His successor immediately called for a new crusade to recapture the Holy City. The three greatest kings in Europe answered the call. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, was the most powerful ruler in Europe. He assembled a massive German army and chose to march overland through Anatolia. Philip Augustus, King of France, and Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart, prepared to sail with their armies across the Mediterranean. This was the Third Crusade, the most famous of all the Crusades. The Third Crusade was a titanic struggle that lasted from 1189 to 1192. Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia in June of 1190. The great emperor, trying to cool himself in the water after a hot march, was swept away by the current. His death shattered his army. Most of the German Crusaders turned back or scattered. It was a devastating blow to the crusade before it had even properly begun. But Richard the Lionheart proved to be a formidable opponent. Richard was everything Saladin respected in an enemy. He was brave to the point of recklessness, leading charges personally when most kings stayed safely behind the lines. He was bold in strategy, willing to take risks that other commanders avoided, and he was brilliant on the battlefield, with an intuitive grasp of tactics that made him one of the great generals of the Middle Ages. Richard captured the city of Acre after a long siege that had been dragging on for nearly 2 years. When Richard arrived with fresh troops and ships, the balance finally tipped. Acre fell. He then marched his army down the coast toward Jerusalem, defeating Saladin's forces at the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191. The Muslim cavalry tried their usual tactics of harassment and feigned retreats. Richard kept his army in tight formation until the perfect moment. Then he launched a devastating charge that shattered the Muslim line. For a moment it seemed possible that Richard might actually recapture Jerusalem. The contest between Saladin and Richard became the stuff of legend, even in their own time. Though they never met face to face, they exchanged messages and gifts through intermediaries. A strange respect grew between them. When Richard fell ill with a fever during the campaign, Saladin sent his personal physician to treat him. He sent fresh fruit packed in snow brought down from the mountains to help the English king recover. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 replacement horses of the finest Arabian breed. He said that a king should not have to fight on foot. It would be shameful for such a warrior to be brought low by a lack of horses. These gestures of chivalry were not just propaganda. Both men seemed to genuinely respect each other. They were enemies in a holy war, fighting for causes they believed in absolutely. But they recognised in each other a greatness that transcended the conflict. Despite his victories, Richard never reached Jerusalem. Saladin's strategy of avoiding pitched battles and attacking Richard's supply lines wore down the Crusader army. Twice Richard marched toward the Holy City, and twice he was forced to turn back. He understood that even if he could take Jerusalem, he could not hold it. After 3 years of brutal warfare, both sides were exhausted. In 1192, Richard and Saladin negotiated a truce. The Crusaders would keep a strip of coastal cities. Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit Jerusalem, but the Holy City itself would remain in Muslim hands. Saladin did not long survive his great struggle with Richard. The years of constant warfare had broken his health completely. He was only in his mid-50s, but he had the body of an old man. He had spent his adult life in the saddle, marching and fighting across vast distances in brutal conditions. He had survived assassination attempts, sieges, and battles, but the cumulative toll was more than his body could bear. He also had no money left. Saladin had given away his wealth throughout his life. He was famous for his generosity to the poor, to scholars, to soldiers, to anyone who came to him with a need. He had given away so much of his wealth to charity that when he died, there was not enough money in his personal treasury to pay for his funeral. The great sultan who had ruled from Egypt to Iraq died nearly penniless. On March 4th, 1193, Saladin died in Damascus. He was only 55 years old. He was buried in a simple tomb next to the great Umayyad Mosque, the holiest site in Damascus. His empire, like so many others before and after, did not long survive him. His sons and relatives immediately began fighting over the succession. Within decades, the Ayyubid dynasty he had founded controlled only fragments of his vast domain. The Crusader states, which Saladin had nearly destroyed, would survive for another century until they were finally conquered by a new power, the Mamluks. But if Saladin's empire was temporary, his legend was eternal. In the Muslim world, he became the model of the ideal ruler. He was pious, spending long hours in prayer and listening to readings from the Quran. He was just, hearing complaints from common people, and ensuring they received fair treatment. He was generous, giving away his wealth until he had nothing left. He was brave, leading his armies personally into battle despite the risks. He united the faithful when they had been divided for generations. He drove back the infidels and recovered Jerusalem for Islam. His conquest of Jerusalem remained the defining moment of Islamic triumph over the Crusaders. Centuries later, when the Ottoman Empire lost Jerusalem to the British in World War I, Muslims around the world mourned by remembering Saladin. Arab leaders from Nasser to Saddam Hussein invoked his name to rally their people. He remains perhaps the most admired figure in Islamic history after the Prophet himself and his companions. What is remarkable is that Saladin became a hero in Europe as well. Even during the Crusades, when Christian writers should have hated everything about him, they praised his honour and his mercy. The troubadours sang songs about his chivalry. The contrast between his treatment of Jerusalem and the Crusaders' massacre in 1099 was not lost on Christian observers. Many European writers used Saladin as a tool to criticise their own rulers. If a Muslim sultan could show such mercy, they asked, why could Christian kings not do the same? Dante Alighieri, in his Divine Comedy, placed Saladin in limbo alongside the great philosophers and heroes of antiquity. Limbo was not heaven, but it was not hell either. It was the place where virtuous pagans spent eternity. Saladin was the only Muslim so honoured. Dante clearly admired him, placing him in the company of Homer and Aristotle and Caesar. Medieval European romances portrayed him as the perfect knight, more chivalrous than many Christian kings. One popular legend even claimed that Saladin had secretly been knighted by a Christian knight. This image of Saladin as the noble enemy, the honourable foe who put Christian kings to shame, persisted for centuries. It will be when European writers in the Enlightenment wanted to criticise religious fanaticism and praise tolerance, they pointed to Saladin as an example. He became a symbol of how Muslims and Christians could coexist with mutual respect. The historical Saladin was of course a more complicated figure than the legend. He was capable of great cruelty as well as great mercy. After the Battle of Hattin, he personally oversaw the execution of hundreds of captured Templars and Hospitallers. He prosecuted brutal wars against fellow Muslims for over a decade before turning on the Crusaders. He was a skilled political operator who used religion to justify his rise to power. Yet even accounting for the gap between legend and reality, Saladin remains a remarkable figure. He rose from obscurity to rule the largest empire of his age. He was a Kurdish outsider in a world dominated by Arabs and Turks. Yet he built a coalition that included all of them. He accomplished what no Muslim leader had managed in 90 years, the recapture of Jerusalem. And he did so in a way that earned him the respect even of his enemies. At a moment when he had every right to revenge and every expectation of atrocity, he chose restraint. That choice echoed through history. The world that Saladin knew has long since vanished. The Crusader kingdoms are dust. The Ayyubid dynasty is a footnote. The Abbasid Caliphate fell to the Mongols less than 70 years after Saladin's death. Even the great cities he ruled, Damascus and Cairo and Jerusalem, have been transformed beyond recognition. But the questions that his life raises remain as relevant as ever. How should we treat our enemies? Is mercy weakness or strength? Can people of different faiths live together in peace? Saladin did not provide perfect answers to these questions. No one does. But his life suggested that honour and mercy were possible even in the midst of holy war. That suggestion, that possibility, is perhaps his greatest legacy. To walk the streets of the old city of Jerusalem today is to walk through the world that Saladin fought for and won. The dome of the rock still gleams golden in the sunlight, its beautiful tiles restored and renewed over the centuries. The Al-Aqsa Mosque still calls the faithful to prayer 5 times each day. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre still draws Christian pilgrims from around the world, just as it did when Saladin allowed them to return. The Western Wall still echoes with Jewish prayers, as it has since Jews were allowed back into the city. 3 faiths, 3 peoples, sharing one holy city. It is not a perfect peace. It never has been. The modern conflicts over Jerusalem are different from the Crusades, but no less bitter. But the city endures, as Saladin intended it should, sacred to all and closed to none. The walls that Saladin's armies breached have been rebuilt. The gates through which his soldiers marched still stand. The narrow streets still wind through the same quarters they did 800 years ago. The Kurdish boy from Tikrit, who became the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, left behind no great monuments with his name. He built no pyramids, no towering minarets to proclaim his glory. He gave away his wealth until he had nothing. His empire crumbled within a generation. But the city he conquered with mercy still stands. And his name, 800 years later, is still spoken with respect by those who remember what honour means. In a world that often seems to have forgotten the meaning of mercy, the story of Saladin reminds us that even in war, even against enemies we hate, there is a choice. We can choose to be cruel, or we can choose to be just. We can seek revenge, or we can seek peace. Saladin, at the moment of his greatest triumph, chose mercy. That choice made him immortal.